Tonight's meeting, we are being hosted by IMarEST. Bethan Rooney is our presenter. She is the Assistant Director of Port Department for the Port Authority of New York. The talk will be on marine highways. For those of you who are looking for PE credit, the meeting has been accredited for PE credit for 1 PDH. If you're interested in it and you have your form, you can leave that form with either me or with Steve right at the end of the meeting. If you don't have a form but you are interested in it, just let us know. Unfortunately, Alan Rowan, who's the coordinator of that, couldn't make it. But as long as we know you were here, we can get the paperwork sent to you and we can take care of that for you. As we've been trying to do for most of our meetings, especially at least the IMarEST ones, what we did for the last SNAME meeting as well, we try to do these. We're recording these meetings for what's called IMarEST TV. So it's basically it's a way of viewing these online after the fact. For most of the meetings, we are also able to share the presentations with our partner societies, SNAME, ASNE, and SMPE. In that case, let me introduce our presenter. So Bethan Rooney, I have a very don't read it. Schuyler grad. She's involved with the Port Authority now. During our conversation just during dinner, I understand you were also a port engineer and
port captain.
Port captain. Sorry, deputy. Not trying to offend you. My dad was deputy, so I understand the difference. Unfortunately, we have a conflict because I was engineering, so there's a little bit of a family struggle there. But we managed to iron it all out, so we're okay. It looks like an interesting conversation. Hopefully it'll be a little bit interactive as well, talking about American marine highways.
So thanks for being the hardy few that were able to come out tonight. I have to admit, I was sitting in the World Trade Center at various times today, looking at my email, hoping, that there'd be a little bit of a cancellation, and when there wasn't, I was hoping, that many of you would not have canceled and would actually be here to listen to me. So I appreciate you all making the effort to come out tonight and for giving me the opportunity to be here. As mentioned, my name is Beth Rooney. I'll give you my bio, quickly. After graduating from New York Maritime, and I was a decky, majored in marine transportation, got the third mate's license. So probably as the only other decky in the room, I'd ask you to be kind to me. I know next to nothing about engineering. I almost feel unqualified to be here with a bunch of professional engineers of various kinds. So I spent 3 years as a port captain and then joined the Port Authority, a little bit less than 3 years as a port captain, and then joined the Port Authority and just passed my 25th anniversary with the Port Authority and have done a little bit of everything from operations to property management to technology to intermodal transportation. The day after 9/11, my boss gave me a hug and a kiss. Thank God you're okay. You're in charge of security. Had no idea, what national security was, what port security or vessel security was, but found a way of figuring it out and ultimately was instrumental in writing the regulations that we comply with now internationally. Was part of writing ISPIS, the International Ship and Port Security Code, wrote the Maritime Transportation Security Act and many of the resulting regulations, testifying before Congress numerous times in the following 15 years, and then became the Assistant Director in the Port Department of the Port Authority. And right now my portfolio is everything other than operating the facilities day to day and building the facilities. So it's everything from policy, legislation, regulations, strategic planning, business planning, risk management, marketing analysis, strategic analysis, operational efficiencies, operational performance, and our environmental sustainability program. So it's a broad breadth of activities. Have a lot of people, helping me out with all of that. And marine highways now are part of our planning and how we are looking to help distribute the cargo around the region and get some cargo off the road. So without further ado, I'll get into it. I'm going to start talking just a little bit about the port because I think it's important to set the context for why it is that we think the time has come for marine highways to really take off in the New York, New Jersey area, and then dive a little bit further into that. Happy to make this interactive. Stop me at any time and ask whatever questions you might have. So from a high level, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey as a multimodal interstate transportation agency created by Congress in 1921 to promote the movement of passenger and goods between the states of New York and New Jersey and between the states of New York and New Jersey and points overseas, internationally. We operate all of the major airports in the region: Kennedy, LaGuardia, Newark, Teterboro, and then outside of our 25-mile jurisdiction, Stewart Airport up in Orange County, New York. We operate all of the tunnels and bridges that connect New York and New Jersey. So the George Washington Bridge, the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, the 3 Staten Island crossings, Bayonne, Outer Bridge, and Goethals. We operate the PATH, rapid rail system. Not always rapid, but we do operate, the PATH system. We operate a number of the marine terminals and the World Trade Center site. Within the marine terminals, while the Port of New York and New Jersey has about 180 facilities that the Coast Guard has identified as, again, moving people or goods across the dock by water, the Port Authority only touches 14 of those. Of the 14 that we touch, we do all of the containers. So you can see here that the Port Authority's facilities are in Port Newark, Port Elizabeth, Staten Island, Jersey City and Bayonne, and then on the Brooklyn waterfront in the Red Hook neighborhood. Collectively, the Port Authority's marine terminals are over 3,000 acres. Last year we did 6.7 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units. We're not just containers. We talk an awful lot about containers, but we're handling bulk and break bulk commodities as well. We're handling automobiles, and we do have 2 of the 3 cruise terminals in the harbor. So with these statistics, the Port of New York and New Jersey is the 2nd largest gateway in the United States. We are the largest on the East Coast, and we provide the economic activity that is supporting over 400,000 jobs and $100 billion of personal and business income, as well as federal, state, and local tax revenues. What's different about New York and New Jersey that you don't have in a lot of the U.S. ports when it comes to containers is choice. So we have 6 different container terminals that are servicing all of the ocean carriers that are plying, the oceans today. 78% of those ocean carriers are coming to New York and New Jersey first. That allows the cargo to get to market faster. Of those 78% of the carriers that are coming here first, 3 of those services are coming here last as well. So they're coming into New York and New Jersey, and then they're going down the coast making calls in some combination of Baltimore, Norfolk, Charleston, Savannah, circling back up to New York, New Jersey, making another call here, and then going foreign. And that allows for exports to get to market as late as possible. So in the past, when we were not seeing these last ports of call, the exports would either just skip New York, New Jersey completely and would have to load a ship further south, and so we didn't see that benefit. Because of this, we're now seeing we're seeing more of a balance between the import and export container volumes because of these last ports of call. Every corner of the world is serviced by containers coming in. So whereas the West Coast ports are servicing predominantly Asia, we're servicing Asia, we're servicing Central and South America, we're servicing Africa, we're servicing Europe and the Middle East. We have 2 Class 1 railroads. We have over 2,000 drayage companies, trucking companies. We have 5 intermodal chassis providers, so these are the guys that are providing the wheels underneath the containers. And what's really important is that the warehouse and distribution market has been developed around the port. So there's over 1 billion square feet of warehousing space. And we, as consumers, are part of the reason why there's so much warehousing and distribution space, because now it's the Amazon effect. Now it's the pick and pack. Now it's where we order something and we expect that it's going to be on our doorstep, if not tonight when we get home, certainly tomorrow. So that has facilitated the development of more warehouses and pick and pack distribution facilities. In terms of activity, this is really the last decade of activity. In 2009 was the recession. With the exception of the recession, by and large, continued growth. We did see a double-digit growth in 2015, which was hard to sustain. It was about 11% growth. That's hard to keep up with that. So a little bit of a dip in 16 and then grew again in 17. And right now in 18, we've seen very, very strong volumes, and we're tracking well that we will surpass the 7 million TEUs in 2018. If we just do the same volume for the next 2 months, for November and December, that we did last year, we will surpass the 7 million mark. The purple line is our intermodal rail cargo, and that's about tracking around 15% of all of our cargo goes out by rail today. That 15% that's going out by rail is everything that is beyond 250 miles. That 250 miles is going to become important when we talk about the marine highway. But this is cargo that is going to New England, going to Eastern Canada, going to the Midwest, going as far west as Kansas City, a lot of it going into Chicago and the Ohio Valley, and sometimes going as far south as Tennessee. So 15% of it is going by rail, and 85% of our nearly 7 million containers is going by truck. That truck traffic is what we're trying to address with the marine highway. So 85% of 7 million is a lot of trucks. Probably no surprise as to who our trading partners are. China is certainly a big player, but as we were talking about at dinner, manufacturing is beginning to shift south into Southeast Asia, into India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Malaysia, and as those countries are getting more and more into manufacturing, and you're now manufacturing in Southeast Asia, the cargo is coming to the U.S. East Coast through the Suez Canal in an all-water route. And that gives New York and New Jersey a better competitive position now. So that allows us to compete better for that middle-of-the-country type cargo. So we're very conscientious of world trends, global trends, and what's going on in the world. We're even looking today at what's happening with the Chinese investment in Africa with the Belt and Road program, where there are now ports and distribution centers and manufacturing facilities being developed in Africa. And with that, the expectation is that the cargo will come into the East Coast, and instead of coming into the West Coast, it'll come into the East Coast and land bridge across the U.S. into the Midwest and potentially to the West Coast, as China is investing in Africa. The economic activity, again, I spoke to this just a few minutes ago, but 400,000 jobs and $100 billion of federal, state, local tax and personal and business income. But why New York and New Jersey? Population, 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 population. So 127 million people can be reached within 36 hours of the container arriving on dock. That's 36 hours by train is this particular metric. But when you think about how quickly we could get a barge from New York, New Jersey to Boston or to Portland, Maine, this is still a viable metric. At the same time, a third of the nation's GDP is within that same 250-mile radius. So the purchasing power not only are the people here, but the purchasing power of the people, the affluence, in general of the population is right here within the port's backyard. And by comparison, looking at our competitors on the East Coast, our largest competitors on the East Coast being Norfolk and Savannah, you're looking at populations here within an hour to 4 hours, sometimes as much as 4 times as many as our next largest competitor. So these figures are again what we're looking at when we think about how do we distribute the cargo and how do we get the cargo closer to the market that it's necessary to reach. The other issue that is driving our discussions on the Marine Highway is the change in vessel size. So what we're showing you here is the change in container vessel size in the last 5 years, where, and I know it's hard to read, and again the presentation can be shared, but 5 years ago, just 5 years ago, 2/3 of all of the containers that came into the Port of New York and New Jersey came in on a ship that was 6,000 TEUs or smaller, and 1/3 was on the 8,000 TEU or larger. Now it's completely changed within 5 years, where 2/3 of all of the containers coming into the Port of New York and New Jersey is on a ship that is 8,000 TEUs or larger. And what we're seeing on these larger vessels is we're seeing exchanges of cargo that are upwards of 70% of the vessel's capacity. So if you have a container ship that has 10,000 TEU capacity on it, we're taking 70% of that, so 7,000 of the 10,000 TEUs are coming on or off in the Port of New York and New Jersey, and that means that the other U.S. East Coast ports that the ship is stopping at are splitting the remaining 30%. And that's, again, based on the population and the market reach, that we're taking such a large percentage of the vessel's capacity. So the ships are getting larger, and with the larger ships and the economies of scale that the ocean carriers are seeking with these larger ships, we are taking a larger percentage of the cargo here in our area. As part and parcel of what we're doing is also not only servicing the cargo that we're handling today and trying to continue to make sure that we handle that in a safe and efficient and environmentally friendly and secure way, but we're also focused on the future. And we're focused on what is the cargo growth going to look like as we move forward in the next 10, 15, 20, and even 30 years. So we are in the midst of developing a 30-year port master plan. That port master plan is focused on 2047. What is the region going to look like? What is the population going to look like? Where are the economic trends, and where are we going to see recessions? Again, is the population going to shift out of the area? All those types of things have gone into the development of the Port Master Plan. And in that, we're looking at cargo volume doubling, if not tripling, in the next 30 years. Again, this is just on the containers. When we look at the cruise industry, bulk, break bulk, ro-ro with automobiles, we are also seeing a similar type of growth in those other commodities as well. But we're focused in this discussion on the containers. So within the next 30-year period, doubling and tripling the volume. Our existing capacity, that line that's at about the 9 million, is using our facilities where is and how is. Without changing anything operationally about our facilities, we tap out our capacity at about 9 million TEUs. So we've got to change the way that we use our facilities. Those are any number of things that can happen. That's a combination of longer hours. Today our terminals are operating generally from 6 a.m. to 4 or 5, in one case to 7 p.m., but generally the terminals are only operating 8, 10, max 12 hours a day. So if we change our operating hours, we will increase our capacity. We changed the way we lay out the terminals in terms of the equipment that is being used and the densification of the container stacks. You can increase your capacity. You make changes to your gate, you make changes to your ship-to-shore container handling equipment, your gantry cranes. You use appointment systems in order to pick up the containers by truck. You put more out by rail, you put some out by barge. All of those types of changes will increase our capacity above the 9 million TEUs that we have now, and hopefully bring us to a point where within the existing footprint, because we really don't have a lot of space to expand to, and we don't have new land that we can create some more container terminals on, but those types of operational changes will increase our capacity. And because we're a truck port and we're going to tap out on our capacity at some point, we're really looking seriously at what are the alternatives and how can we develop more capacity. So there has been a tremendous amount of discussion for probably the last 15 to 20 years about the American Marine Highway, and how is it that we can utilize the underutilized waterways in order to move cargo around a little bit better. In New York, New Jersey, we had an initiative that started over 20 years ago to move containers between the Brooklyn waterfront and the New Jersey waterfront, and that was a temporary project that was put in place when the Gowanus Expressway was being reconstructed. I'm not so sure that the Gowanus Expressway was ever completed, but that barge service is still operating, and that's moving containers, about 30,000 containers a year, between the Red Hook Container Terminal in Brooklyn and their supporting barge terminal in Port Newark. Those are generally containers that are coming off of a ship that calls directly in Brooklyn, but the cargo is being distributed west of the Hudson. So as opposed to going on the already congested highways and roadways, it's being moved on the barge over to New Jersey. At the same time, again, 15, 20 years ago, Columbia Coastal, which is a local barge and transportation company, they're involved in trucking and barge services and chassis depots and empty container depots. They operated barge services that ran between New York and New Jersey and Boston, between us and Philly, and between us and Baltimore. But those services kind of dried up, over the years, part and parcel with the recession, and then never picked up again. So it's worked. Barge services work, but they just haven't had a lot of support for them in recent years, but a lot of talk about them in recent years. So what's driving the change that we see right now? When you think about containerization starting in 1956, it was before Eisenhower had signed the bill that created the interstate transportation system and the interstate highway system. So Malcolm McLean, as the founder of containerization, had these tractor trailers and these trucks, and instead of packaging and moving parcels and packages and drums and pallets and boxes one by one, let me just put my trailer on the deck of a ship and move that ship between Newark, New Jersey and Texas. And when he did that for the first time, it was before the highway system was fully built. Now we have a highway system that is fully built, but is 60 plus years old and is crumbling around us. Where the infrastructure hasn't been maintained, appropriately. The infrastructure is not appropriately sized for the population, for the numbers of cars, the numbers of trucks, and what have you. So we have a highway transportation system that is over capacity, that is not well maintained, and again is crumbling around us. Because of the condition of the highways and byways, states that have never thought about tolling in the past are now thinking about tolling. So within the last year, the state of Rhode Island has put tolls on the I-95 corridor in Rhode Island only for trucks. So now trucks are paying to move through Rhode Island. Connecticut is thinking about putting tolls on the I-95 corridor, similar to what the New Jersey Turnpike is, where you pay a different price based on the distance that you're traveling. I guess the New York State Thruway does that as well. At the same time, truck drivers who are moving this cargo have strict hour of service requirements in terms of how long can these men and women drive before they have a mandatory rest period. The rules have not changed, but what has changed is that they're no longer keeping it in a paper logbook that, quite frankly, they could fudge and give themselves a little bit of extra time when they needed it, and now it's being done with an electronic logging device that is connected to the truck's engine. So there's no longer the ability to give yourself a little extra time if you haven't completed the voyage within your required transit time that you're allowed to do. That has resulted in less truck capacity than there was at the beginning of this year before the rule went into strict compliance. There's a shortage of truck drivers around the country. Very hard to attract and retain drivers of trucks. And as a result, now that you have these strict hours of service requirements, if your cargo comes into Virginia and you need to deliver that cargo to New Jersey, you can no longer go to the port, pick it up, drive it up to New Jersey, and get back to Virginia within the 11 hours of time that you have in order to drive the truck. So now that move becomes a move that either is going to be a 2-day move, where you've got to worry about the truck driver, sleeping overnight, the security of the container, there's not enough truck parking, on the highways or near the highways. So you either have to worry about secure parking for that truck, or you have to have a second driver, and now you're driving in tandem, and you've got 2 guys or gals, held up, on that same move that just a year ago was being done by a single guy. And then finally, with the alliances, just as I was talking about how the ships are getting larger and the cargo is coming on larger container ships, the ocean carriers have merged, and many mergers and acquisitions and alliances within those ocean carriers, and now they're not calling the same number of ports. They don't have the same number of services. They're not all of the same carriers used to call every port, and now they've cut back on that. So for example, there's an ocean carrier that is calling a port in New England today, and they're dropping 500 containers on a port call in New England, and then they're coming, that same ocean carrier, same ship is coming to New York and New Jersey, and they're dropping about 7,000 containers. So 500 in Port A, 7,000 in Port B. It doesn't take much to think about how much longer is the ocean carrier going to be able or willing to go through the expense and the time in that voyage to drop 500 containers in New England, when you can drop those containers in New York and New Jersey, and on a barge or on a rail service that we have going daily to New England anyway, put those containers on a rail or the barge, if for some reason we don't get the barge up and operating. So the federal government, through the Maritime Administration, has been looking at marine highways for a number of years. This American Marine Highway is a national program. The U.S. Maritime Administration allows route or service sponsors, and they're generally port authorities or departments of transportation within various states, to submit to the federal government an application for a designation as a marine highway. That request for a designation as a marine highway lays out where the service will take place, what those nodes in the service will be, whether it's 2, or 3 or 4. So this map is showing you the existing marine highways that have been designated by the federal government. Some are very viable and are working very well. Others have been designated and are really in their infancy or embryonic, stages, just trying to do the planning to figure out how do we make these things viable. But by being designated by the U.S. Maritime Administration, it allows that sponsoring entity to be eligible to receive federal funding through grants in order to help support the services. So we are the sponsor, the Port Authority is the sponsor of a couple of these marine highway services and routes, and because of that existing barge service, for example, between Brooklyn and Newark, we have been able to secure grant funding for 3 different projects. One was, we thought, very innovative and creative, where for a crane operator to be operating a crane and landing containers on the deck of a 14,000 TEU vessel is very different than handling the containers efficiently on a barge that is 200 feet long and 78 feet wide. So, and the cost of the barge service, the most expensive component of a barge service is labor. So if we could train the labor to be more efficient in their cargo and crane handling operations, and you can get even one more move per hour out of the crane operator, then the economics of a barge transport changes dramatically. So with that idea in mind, we applied for a grant and we were able to secure 3 state-of-the-art crane simulators, where now every longshoreman who operates a crane in the Port of New York and New Jersey, and every new longshoreman who's trying to operate a crane, gets time in the simulator, and we're able to train these men and women or weed them out, determine very quickly that they don't have the ability, the dexterity, the wherewithal, the patience, whatever the case might be, to operate a ship-to-shore crane. We're determining that in a simulator that's on the ground, as opposed to in an $18 million piece of equipment that has to be taken out of service in order to do the training and the evaluation before we put them live and actually working a ship. So we secured a grant for crane simulators. We secured a grant to obtain 2 cargo handling equipment reach stackers, and to upgrade a fendering system in the port, because the fendering system was, whether it was the deckies, driving the tugboat and pulling the barges along, but it seems like every other time they were coming alongside, they were damaging the hull of the barge, puncturing a hole in it. We would take it out of service. It'd have to go to the dry dock, to be repaired, and so the fendering system was determined to not be appropriate for barges as opposed to for ships, so we're working on upgrading the fendering system. So being a designated route gives you access to federal funding to help support the services that you're trying to move on containers, the containers. And we add that the marine highway designation is not limited to containers. So there's a number of different options, and there's many different options, out there. This is traditional, container on deck barges. These are, in fact, the 2 barges that the Port Authority owns. One is called the New York, and the other is called the New Jersey. They're 420 to 450 TEU barges. These have been in operation now for 20 years, and again, these are just moving within the harbor, moving containers, again, up to 450 of them at a time. The other operation that New York, New Jersey, the Port Authority runs is this unique operation called the New York, New Jersey Rail Float, and this is a designated service as well. So I believe this is the last remaining rail float operational in the country, and this deck barge is actually outfitted with rail tracks, and we take 18 60-foot rail cars and drive them onto the barge in 3 parallel sets of rail spurs. And this is the facility in Jersey City, an area of Jersey City called Greenville. And the barge floats across the harbor to Brooklyn at 65th Street, and then goes in a local rail service in Brooklyn. The alternative to this particular service requires those rail cars that are in New Jersey to go up the west side of the Hudson, up to Selkirk, New York, cross over, and come back down in order to get to Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. So the alternative is this rail float, which is operational now. The Port Authority acquired it maybe a decade or so ago. We've been ramping up the service during that time frame, and I believe this year we should be close to about 7,000 revenue moves in 2018. And that's moving domestic cargo. So again, the Marine Highway System is not directly tied to international cargo and is not tied to containers either. This is a design, so there is an M95 of the Marine Highway running up and down the entire 95 corridor from Maine to Florida. And this is McAllister Towing, who had gotten a grant in order to design what would be a cellular articulated tug barge. So this design was actually part of a Marine Highway grant application, and McAllister is ready and waiting for a viable service so that they can lay the keel and get working on something like this. But the difference, and I probably don't have to tell you guys there, you guys as many of you as naval arcs, but the maneuverability and the reliability of an ATB as opposed to a traditional deck barge that's being towed or pushed is very different. So this is something that particularly McAllister aspires to get to beyond just a container on deck barge. And then down south, now in the Puerto Rico, Florida run, there are active marine highways that are using a Conroe container and ro-ro vessel that has the capacity for 2,400 TEUs and 400 vehicles. And when I think about a 2,400 TEU ship, when I went on my first ship as a cadet observer, at 18 or 19 years old, it was a 2,400 TEU ship. And I can remember my parents dropping me off, at the dock in Elizabeth, and my mother getting out of the car and being like, "Oh my God, that thing floats. How does that thing float?" And now in New York, New Jersey, we're handling ships that are 14,000, plus TEUs regularly. So this combined container ro-ro vessel is operational on a marine highway system down south right now. And then this is a concept that comes out of Germany, and these folks are knocking on our door regularly. When you think about barge services and feeder services in Europe, they've been operational in Europe for many, 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 many years. And the Rhine River system, is really dependent upon feeder vessels like this. But this is a concept that comes out of Germany. This hasn't been built yet, but this is basically a self-unloader where you don't need any infrastructure, you don't need a crane, on the dock, you don't need cargo handling equipment, where the crane and the boom on the crane here, articulates so that you can be running the containers in a north-south direction or an east-west direction, whether you're picking them up off of the barge or moving them onto the dock. And this is a self-propelled vessel as well. One of the options that this would provide, if we were able to move in this direction, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, is that we could be doing this operation outboard of the vessel at dock. So one of the things that becomes challenging is the cost of multiple handlings of the container. So if you can efficiently and safely move the containers directly from the ship onto a barge, it will be faster, to service. It will eliminate a number of extra handling moves while you're on the dock. In order to try to make all of this come to fruition, just last month at New York Maritime College, the college and the U.S. Maritime Administration sponsored a Marine Highway Conference, and at that conference, the Port Authority and the New York City Economic Development Corporation announced the creation of the North Atlantic Marine Highway Alliance, or what we're calling NAMHA. Everything has to have an acronym in this industry. So the Alliance, for short, is built off of the successes of another group that the Port Authority has been operating for about 4 years now, called the Council on Port Performance. And the Council on Port Performance was created when the port was really suffering from a number of inefficiencies in the supply chain that led to congestion. And what we did is we brought together all of the various stakeholders in the industry that had something to gain or lose from those inefficiencies. And it might not have been that sector's fault or responsibility, but they were impacted by it. So there were upstream and downstream effects of what was happening, whether it was a labor shortage or a computer system issue or an equipment shortage or a Hurricane Sandy type issue or things like that. And that Council on Port Performance has been extremely successful in moving the Port of New York and New Jersey forward in terms of being efficient and reliable, because all stakeholders had come together to work on a common problem and to identify common problems and common solutions and take ownership, for these issues, because if it affected your bottom line, it was affecting somebody else's bottom line as well. So growing on or building on the successes of that type of forum, we thought a similar forum to that would help us bring the marine highway discussions from a bunch of random fractured discussions that dozens of people and organizations around the region were having, but really bring everybody together to work towards a common goal. So we kicked off the Alliance, or announced the creation of the Alliance, at the Marine Highway Conference last month at New York Maritime, and then kicked off the actual Alliance with membership from terminal operators and port authorities, equipment providers, and other interested stakeholders from Maine to Virginia just 2 or 3 weeks ago in our offices here at the World Trade Center. So our goal of this group is to identify the impediments and challenges to a successful, economically viable, self-sufficient marine highway system. We cannot get into a marine highway system that is going to be subsidized, even at the beginning. Because the moment you throw a subsidy at something, it's very, very difficult to get away from it, and we really want this to be viable out the gate from an economic perspective. What is going to be critical to the success of this is going to be identifying the shippers, identifying the cargo owners that are going to be willing to put their cargo on these barges. And it's about change. It's about getting the traffic planners, the routers, the logisticians for these shippers. Everybody from LL Bean and Ralph Lauren to Black & Decker and you name the company. Those folks have been doing their jobs the exact same way in terms of routing their cargo and using truck and rail and not thinking about marine highway. So we have to change their thinking. We think part of changing their thought process and getting them to change their mode of transportation, some of it's also going to come from recognizing the social costs of doing this. That moving on a truck, is less environmentally friendly than moving on a barge or moving by rail. So the group is started, and we're determined to have at least a pilot of a system operating in 2019. And these are some of the routes that we're looking at, with New York, New Jersey, being the hub, and potentially routes that could take us to New Haven or New Bedford, Boston. Off of the chart, obviously, is Portland, Maine, potentially, down to Philadelphia, also, talking about Wilmington. So no answers, yet as to what or where or how, but these are the types of things that we're looking at. And right now, the members of the Alliance are in the process of doing SWOT analysis, strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats for these as well as other routes. And we'll begin to map those in terms of the likelihood of success and the feasibility of success in the next week or two. But, back of the envelope thinking in terms of cost, because it all comes down to cost. When you look at these 4 gateways, New Haven, New Bedford, Boston, and Portland, and you compare the cost of moving a container by barge versus by truck, and in all cases, with the exception of New Haven, barge is more cost efficient. Not by a lot, right? Only between $9 and $220. So that's probably not enough to make it viable. One of the things that we want to make sure that you have is a match back, that you have cargo that's going out, but you need to have something that's going to come back because it's going to share the cost. So that's one of the things that we're going to try to address in this. But when you add the social savings, so MARAD has put together a calculator that you plug in a whole bunch of data into this calculator, which is publicly available, and they allow you to calculate out the other types of, again, what we're calling social costs. And that gives you the cost savings that's associated with congestion, with carbon dioxide, avoided noise, fuel savings, less wear and tear on the infrastructure, so saved maintenance costs on public infrastructure, and the reduction in accidents and the avoidance of fatalities and serious injuries. I'll be darned if I know how they actually came up with these calculations or the formulas that go into these calculations, but when you plug and play everything into this calculator and you add those social savings costs, those social savings costs are now anywhere between $240 and $900, making the total savings, including for New Haven, much more attractive than it is without these. Now, that's not to say that the social savings is going to be, the thing that's going to convince folks to do this, shippers to do it. For them, the social savings, isn't nearly as important, obviously, as the bottom line. But there are certainly companies out there that, are green, that are, environmentally friendly, that are looking at these types of things. And we believe that with certain customers, if we begin to talk about some of these social costs, that they might be more motivated to move towards a barge service than without those social costs. So as we've moved on and begun to identify some of the challenges, cost is certainly going to be one of them. Folks are not going to be keen on changing their mode of transportation unless the cost structure is appropriate. Most importantly, we're going to have the density of cargo to make it viable. If we can only get, so when you think about, so one of the things I said at the beginning was New York and New Jersey has an advantage because we have multiple terminals, but when it comes to a marine highway, that might actually be a disadvantage because now we need to be able to have the density of cargo in one place that's destined to another node. So if we have a barge that is going to have to go, in our case, to MAR and Port Newark Container Terminal and APM and GCT in order to pick up enough cargo that's destined to Boston, that too is going to be challenging in terms of what a shipper wants. cost, efficiency, reliability, predictability. So we're going to need to be able to leverage, hopefully, those larger ships that are discharging 70% of their cargo, and maybe, you know, a shipper that has 200 containers at a time on a ship that are going to a particular location. Those are the types of things that we can begin to look at, and that's the data that we're beginning to dive into now. As I said, just with any other type of transportation, that your schedule, frequency, and reliability is absolutely key. When you, outside of our area, when you look at some of those other port areas, New Bedford, New Haven, Portland, Providence, Quonset, may not have the infrastructure that's necessary in order to develop a container terminal. There's obviously local permitting requirements, there's funding requirements in order to do that. So we're even looking at, based on the infrastructure that is available or the equipment that's available, what are those services that we can start with first, because the other port is ready, more ready to start doing something like this than some of the others. Matchbacks I talked about. One of the other areas of concern, and Customs and Border Protection is a partner with us in this alliance, is the potential of commingling or mingling domestic cargo and international cargo. So one of the things with international cargo that is important is to say, well, when is that international cargo cleared by customs? When is that cargo officially entered into the commerce of the United States and now becomes domestic cargo and is no longer a concern of U.S. Customs and Border Protection for either homeland security, issues, or quota and tariff issues, or intellectual property rights issues? In one case, with a barge service that will run between Port Newark Container Terminal and Brooklyn, we have an agreement in place where the containers are not scanned by U.S. Customs and Border Protection until they reach Brooklyn. That's okay when it's just international cargo. But if we're going to put international and domestic cargo on the same barge, then that's going to be a problem. If we're going to put international and domestic cargo in the same terminal, and that international cargo hasn't been cleared by customs, that could be a problem. So domestic cargo might help us cross the threshold of viability, but then we're going to have to address the security concerns that come along with that. And then ultimately, shippers and beneficial cargo owners, are always skeptical of doing something new. So the good news is, the economic viability of short sea shipping or marine highways, varies, by route, varies by location, but it is that certainly the numbers work out that it certainly can be more cost competitive to put a container on barge than it is to use truck or to use rail. Certainly the further you go, the more competitive it becomes. All of the various issues, I haven't talked about labor, at all, but the labor agreements are an important part of these discussions. So with the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association, doing the work of this cargo handling, the size of the gang that you need to work a barge is not necessarily the size that you need to work a ship. So there, needs to be discussions with labor about making this viable as well. Haven't talked about the harbor maintenance tax. The harbor maintenance tax is basically an ad valorem tax that is on the cargo and is charged in ports in order to maintain the waterways, in order to deepen and dredge and maintain the waterways to a certain depth that's authorized by the Army Corps of Engineers. In almost all cases, the harbor maintenance tax will be charged against a container, an international container, when it arrives in New York and New Jersey, and when it arrives, for example, in Boston. Quonset and Davisville, Rhode Island, have been able to waive the harbor maintenance tax. That's something that we're working with Congress on in order to, hey, if you want to support short sea shipping and the marine highway, we've got to do something to address the harbor maintenance tax. Not suggesting that we eliminate it, but that we perhaps not charge it on short sea shipping cargo at that second U.S. port. So we're working, on those issues, and then again, the social costs, kind of speak for themselves. But while they're important to the federal government, they're important to the public sector, not as important for many of the private sector, but yet still a discussion that we're going to continue to have. So with that, I would be happy to take questions and discuss further.